This is Xenia here from Alexa Real Estate, and this is our Investor IQ podcast and videos. And I've got with me Mr. Goro Gupta. And Goro is actually an inspiration to everyone because he is one of the most successful property investors that I know. And I've got him here because people are just a little bit negative in investing in properties right now. And he's actually an example of somebody who's made it work. So Goro, you and I actually have something in common, and that is that we started investing really early in life.
That's right.
I bought my first property when I was 19 years old, and I bought it for $100,000. So and I have to say my dad helped in guaranteeing a loan. So I went to the bank with my dad. He guaranteed a loan. I bought this property for $100,000. So all of a sudden I had $100,000 loan to pay off. And do you think my dad helped me pay off? No. He actually, being a European dad, he owned a few businesses. One of them was a restaurant, and he made me work my guts out. At 19. So I was just finishing up year 12 at the time, and he was having me on 16-hour shifts because I now owed him money and had to pay off this loan. So I was working 16-hour shifts, and I'm talking about 7 days. So I was working in this restaurant from like 9 a.m. open till 5, and then having a half an hour break, starting the 5:30 shift until close. And close would be like 11, 12 o'clock, and this was 7 days. It's like you don't get a break, and that continued for about 5 years. So I had to take 5 years off between doing year 12 and then going to university because I couldn't fit anything else in. I am actually grateful now because that gave me not only the ability to actually pay off that loan, but that also gave me a lot of business expertise, which I'm using now. But at the time, I had no life at all. So the first time I've ever been drunk was after I was 50 years old. So because I didn't have time to go out.
Waited too long, Xenia. Hold on, after you were 15 or 50? Hold on, I missed that part there.
Oh, 50, like after
No. Everyone that's listening or watching, I guarantee you, Xenia does not look a day over 35. So I'm really confused.
You know what? That's why I like you.
Like, I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah. So that is my story, Goro. So how did you actually get started?
Well, I feel we're kindred spirits. We kind of almost got started similarly, and I'm sure there's some people who are listening or watching today who might actually have a very similar story to you and I. So, when I was in school, Dad started going to these property seminars when I was like 15 or 16, and he got so into them. He's like, Goro, I got to take you to this. And he's like, I'm going to give my son the gift of education, which, from an Indian background, we value education a lot. Right? That's one of our top values as a culture. We created the zero, trigonometry, all that sort of crazy stuff. So we value education. Dad's like, I've got to educate you on everything I'm learning about property because these are irreplaceable skills, because you're not going to learn this at school. In fact, you'll probably learn the opposite at school, right? Which is what's happening these days, let's be honest. And so he started taking me to these property events, and I started I'm like, wow, there's different ways to purchase properties. I learned about deposit bonds. Back then that was a new thing back then, when I was a little bit younger, with much less gray hair. And we were looking at property, and it's like, Dad's like, well, Goro, you've got your heart set on this like Lexus Coupe, and you're working really hard in the business. And Lexus Coupe at that time was 20 grand. And they said, well, we're going to gift you 20 grand, and you can either buy the Lexus with it, or you can use that as a deposit on the property, and we'll help you source the property. And I did. And my first property purchase, look, it wasn't the best purchase, but it helped me understand the property market. It was a studio apartment in Melbourne CBD. Bought it for 120K, and people were like, oh, your dad helped you with your first. I'm like, dude, it was 20 grand.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I paid that back in next to no time. right? So it wasn't a significant amount. In today's money, that's probably worth like 40 grand. People buy their kids' cars much more expensive than that, right? But look, I bought that property. It was a good learning experience. So I picked that up when I was 17. It was an off-the-plan apartment. Took a while to settle. Learned some lessons about why not to buy an off-the-plan apartment. That's a story for probably another podcast another day. Then I bought my second property at 19, same age as you, when you bought your first. And that was a townhouse in Mitcham, which I still hold to this day. I picked it up for 320. It's probably worth about 1.1 mil. We're looking at selling that now because it's highly negatively geared and there's no way to convert that to a high income without putting in extra cash. So we're converting that money into a high performing version of that money. And that for me is what I've learned over the years. You can have growth and that'll make you wealthy, but it won't make you feel rich. Right. So a combination of being wealthy and feeling rich is what I believe most property investors in Australia should aspire to. And it was really easy to do until about a year ago before the Reserve Bank got their dirty mitts into how much we should pay. But that's I could blame the Australian Reserve Bank for that, but it's not an Australia issue, it's a worldwide issue.
Oh, well done, well done. So I remember when the Adelaide real estate market actually hit 100,000. So after I bought my first property, my dad actually took me down to the bank and he said, we're going to go for a loan and we're going to get some more property. And I said, well, how am I going to pay for it? And he said, you know what, it's only the first one that's hard.
Yeah.
There's this thing called equity. And I was going, what the hell? So we went out that weekend and we bought 3 properties in that weekend. And we had them all settle on the property on the first one. This was a few years later. But I remember I bought a property for 95,000, and then a couple of days later, I bought another property for 130,000. And I remember telling some of my relatives, and they were saying, "You paid over $100,000 for a property? Oh my gosh, is this where the Adelaide market has gone? Like the average property is going to be worth $100,000 now. Nobody is going to be able to ever afford a property again. Where are people going to find 100 grand from?"
Well,
So,
that reminds you of a lesson I learned from Dad. And so my dad's my number one mentor in life. I learned so many things. And he didn't say this to me directly, but he said this to my cousin. And it was a really pivotal lesson, right? Don't be afraid to pay 20, 30K more for the property you really feel you need in your portfolio, because 6 months will absorb that. Like, I see people penny pinching over 2, 4, 5, 6 grand. I'm like, sometimes I have to tell them, unfortunately, you're not my client, because you know what? The right type of person, the right type of client isn't about penny pinching. They're about, what is my end result? What's this property going to be worth in 10 years' time? Is it going to be worth significantly more than I paid for it? Right. Which is obviously what you did. Sorry to interrupt your story.
oh no, that's okay. Well, I sold that property a few years later after I got married. So when I got married, I had 4 rental properties already.
Okay.
So I sold that property for 650,000 because I wanted to put that money into starting businesses, and I didn't want to work for a job. I did not want a 9-to-5 job. So so the equity of those properties was actually used to create businesses and all of that kind of thing. But the question that I really wanted to ask you was, back then, and we're talking about 30 years ago, people were saying, we've hit an affordability maximum at $100,000, and now they're saying it again. I think the Adelaide market is going towards the average property being $1 million, and they're saying exactly the same thing again. They're saying, nobody is going to come up with $1 million. Nobody is going to be able to afford a property. How are people going to be able to afford properties now that the average value of a property has reached $1 million? So do you have anything to say to that?
I really think Adelaide's underpriced. Like, if you really look at it, so the number one, contrary to what these other guys used to say when I first started learning, like Michael Yardney, and they like always invest in the middle ring, and now they've changed their tune a little bit because they've seen what's happened. And the whole mentality of investing in the middle ring is kind of stuck around. It's there in Adelaide, but watch it change. Mark my words here. I think the outer ring will start growing rapidly in terms of growth, even more so than the middle and inner ring. I'll give you an example of what happens here in Melbourne. And because what happens, it happens in Sydney, then it flows through Melbourne, then it flows through to Brisbane and Adelaide, then it flows through to Perth. It's a flow through effect. Like it's like dropping a pebble in the middle of a pond. It'll have a ripple effect. So I'll give you an example of two properties owned. The property I live in it's about 12K from the CBD, 12, 13K from the CBD. I picked it up for 1.2. It's probably worth about 1.5, maybe 1.6 mil at the moment. By the way, for those people listening, I didn't buy it until I had enough passive income to cover my loan, right? Following rich dad, poor dad principles, right? Keep the basics intact. But then I also bought an investment property out in the outer suburbs, like literally where the train line ends here in Melbourne, in a suburb called Doreen. And the percentage growth of Doreen has been double what it's been here in the middle ring of Melbourne, right? In the middle ring. By the way, I live in what's supposed to be a hipster suburb. I'm not going to tell you what suburb that is for privacy reasons, but it's considered a fairly hipster, up and coming suburb, and this and that, and lots of young families. But still, the outer suburbs growing more, and you wonder why, right? And the key factor is immigration and first buyers. Those are two key factors that I'm finding are growing the market more so than any other fundamental, right? Because let me put it to you this: in Adelaide, it's same thing. Was the same situation in Brisbane 3 to 4 years ago, where it was cheaper almost to buy than it was to rent in some cases, right? Depending on where you're looking to buy, right? And so if you knew how to get the numbers right and you had the loan capacity, you'd go off and buy a property, and that would raise the property price because more and more people buy an area, supply and demand, economics 101. And what happens is that constantly, slowly raises the price. And what happens with newer estates, and I haven't seen this happen in Adelaide yet, but watch it, it's going to come soon, is each stage of the estate will be charging more and more. So growth will be kind of built into that. And a lot of the property forums will go, hey, we don't agree with that and this and that. But you know what? Whether you agree or not, the fundamentals are the fundamentals, right?
Back. So, Goro, you were talking about immigration.
Yes.
And how immigration can increase the prices. Was there any more to that, or?
Well, basically, immigration and first home buyers together collectively, and they could be one and the same, consecutively increase prices in an area more so than fundamentals like being close to somewhere. Because look, just like every other immigrant stream, one of my dad's streams, for example, was to buy a property. That's why he wanted to move overseas. That's why he moved out of Dubai, because being of Indian heritage, you can't buy a property there until very recently. So that's one of the things the great Australian dream. Property is actually very accessible here in Australia, right? Even if you look at Sydney, buying in Bali per square meter is more expensive than buying in Sydney. Who would have thought?
Wow.
Right. And so I personally believe we live in the lucky country where real estate, especially Adelaide, is in a lot of places underpriced for what it really is.
Oh, it is. And some areas of Adelaide are more underpriced. So if you compare the western suburbs where we're in and the eastern suburbs, which are a lot of the richer properties, so if you draw a line from the CBD and go, say, 2 kilometers west or 2 kilometers east, the same if you find exactly the same properties, right, with exactly the same proximity to the city, the one in the western suburbs will be $100,000 to $150,000 less.
Wow.
For the same property. So that tells you that there's a significant increase still to happen within the western suburbs. The only thing that makes the eastern suburbs more expensive is perception. So
I would have thought the western suburbs would have been more like, if you go to Perth, which are your distant cousins over there in Perth, the western suburbs are more expensive than the eastern suburbs, right? And that's because there's landlocked, and over here in the eastern seaboard, the eastern suburbs are more expensive than the west, kind of the same as Adelaide.
Yeah. Well, both are landlocked in Adelaide. So the western suburbs is landlocked by the beach, so
Yes.
you can't go any more west than the sea.
Yes.
And
North
the eastern
and south.
suburbs are landlocked by the hills. So both of them are landlocked. But yeah, it's just perception on one side makes it more expensive for
Yeah.
now. For now, I think.
You watch what's going to happen. My prediction is, if we're talking about property growth, the north and south, there's going to be new states popping up, and those new states are going to prop up growth, as long as it doesn't overfuel growth, which is what I'm seeing in Perth, which is what happened in Brisbane. Now it's sort of tapered down, and the market's caught up. But the only thing to be wary of, if there's a significant overselling, like there is currently happening in Perth once again after 20 years of no growth.
Well, that actually leads me to the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about. You were talking about immigration,
Mhm.
and I presume that you mean overseas immigration coming in. Well, Adelaide in the last couple of years, so 2020, 2021, and a little bit of 2022, has actually experienced for the first time, probably ever, a positive net interstate migration. So people from Melbourne and Sydney have migrated into Adelaide. Before that, we were actually getting a net outflow of residents from Adelaide to Melbourne and Sydney for jobs. So for the first time, we've seen a migration into Adelaide. Now that was actually artificially constructed by government lockdowns. So governments actually locked down Melbourne and Sydney due to COVID for a long period of time, pushing people into Adelaide and Queensland.
Yeah.
Queensland actually got a lot more migration than Adelaide, but Adelaide did get enough to actually push the prices up by about 30%.
Well, I actually brought two villas in the Gold Coast because of lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
One for Dad, one for myself, because we couldn't trust the wonderful dictator that ran this state, which is still doing funny things with property. So I don't know. Yeah, the less I say about that.
Yeah, so what happened in Adelaide is that the prices actually increased significantly. The rents went up, and that was because of the net positive migration. And also what the government did is shut down a supply chain. So if you increase demand and decrease supply, what's going to happen to the prices? They're going to go up, right? So they shut down the supply
And
chain.
free money.
The builders and developers that were supplying the Adelaide market, they were all shut down, causing the prices of things like bricks and shower heads and whatever building materials to actually go up. So that's artificially constructed, which means that, when people are complaining that, rents are no longer affordable or houses are no longer affordable, well, that was all artificial. It wasn't supposed to be like that. If you look at the normal supply demand curves in Adelaide, they were very, very, they were going up by about 45 degrees, not 90 degrees,
Yep.
like it is now. But you actually have some strategies to hold on to properties even when they are overpriced.
I
You want
do.
to tell us about those?
Well, before I go there, let's just talk about government policy. Just today, I was asked to comment by a particular Labor MP in National, who's a good friend of mine, and on the Housing Future Fund. And I said in my voice, I said, the way the government policy is being done at the moment, in my opinion, there's a better way for the free market to fix it. And that'll lead on to answering this question.
Yeah.
I believe the free market, the mum and dad investors, have a lot more power than we think we do. Right? It is not up to the government to help us fix our problems,
Mhm.
possibly, to assist with fixing them, to create a pathway. But I personally believe the mum and dad investor, given the right opportunity, given the right environment, can fix most social problems around in the housing space. Right. And part of fixing that is it's a twofold benefit, right? So I've just talked about the social benefit of I've just talked, there's a social benefit to what I'm about to talk about. Now, the financial benefit is, as you mentioned, we turn this thing from, we turn what is typically a 2 or 3% yield into a 7 to 8% yield in some cases, even 10% I've seen in cases, in terms of shared accommodation. Right.
Mhm.
Now, when my dad first moved into the country, and I keep using my dad as an example because it just keeps, family's important, right? He moved into an illegal share house, and most immigrants, when they first come to the country, most students when they come to the country, which is, we're expecting a net, what is it, 1.5 million immigrants into the country over the next, 5 years. Like, those numbers are nuts. There is no way, and one person or a couple, unless they're really, really, really well off, should be able to, compared to other countries, should be like literally having a whole house to themselves, right? Unless you've got kids, that's a completely different story, right? But if you're a single or a couple, hey, we have um, some of the lowest house density in the modernized world, in the first world, and we actually have lower house density now than pre-COVID. So there's actually less share housing around now than prior to COVID. And there's a couple of ways to do that, right? There's a really simple way where either you can actually there are ways, and you have to look at each state. Each state is different, I believe, in this, where sometimes you can have up to 3 tenants in one house, but it should be built the right way. You don't want to give them one bathroom between 3 people. That's kind of not the right thing.
Mhm.
And that's an easy way to do it, and all depends on your estates and your property manager. Then there may not be any laws for conversion, but then there are laws where you can get up to 12 people living in one house. So I'll give you an example of what we did in my childhood home in Northcote, where I grew up here in Melbourne, right? For those Greek people, it's that same Northcote that you're thinking of. It was mini Greece when I was growing up there. So basically in Northcote, what we did was, the auction price was not coming to where we wanted it to be, and I had an ace up my sleeve. I said, Dad, if the auction needs to get pass it in. I'll turn this thing around from $900 a week to $2,000 to $3,000 a week. Right. It's now getting about $3,000 a week, by the way. So what we did is we converted that house into a legitimate rooming house, lodged for a rooming house license, did all the right, furnished it. So it total cost us about 150K, right? So it wasn't the cheapest thing to do. However, our rents went up threefold. Right? And that's typically what we find. And you have to have the right property manager. So if you think about doing this with your regular Ray Whites, ain't going to happen, right? You need a property manager that's going to know what entry and exit reports look like for each room, how to
Mhm.
manage damage in shared spaces. So with that sort of understanding, not just half-assing it, it can be done. But there is risk. And with that risk, though, there is significant reward. So that's one way on how we've turned some of these properties around to a highly cash flow positive. And that also solves a rental crisis, in my opinion. A large portion of rental crisis is because, as I said, singles and couples are taking up whole houses by themselves. And from a pure economics point of view, that's not sustainable.
Mm. Makes sense. So it does require somebody to put in a lot of effort. We've managed probably about 40 multi-let properties in Alexa over the years. We don't now because people were not doing them properly. And the risk to us was the damage in common areas. That's what we found to be the biggest risk. But it sounds like you're doing it properly. You're
Yeah.
not having you're not putting sheds at the back and having people in sheds, which is what
Oh, don't
sometimes
even get me
people
started
say.
about some of the stuff I've seen out there.
Oh
It's just,
no.
if you're gonna do it, don't half-ass it. Just
Yeah,
put
do
in
it
nice
properly.
equipment so you create a good quality tenant. We put TVs and nice beds with bed heads, and
Yeah.
like, we make the house look inviting, and so we don't attract someone that wants to pay $200 a week, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
in our Northcote house, our minimum rent there is like $350 or $400 for one room, right?
Oh, well done. Yeah.
Yeah. And we've got our highest renting room there is $550 a week. That's because it's basically a mini house into itself. It's got its own little lounge room, its own little kitchen. But once again, it's not for everyone, but I think even a beginner investor can start looking at the smaller version of that. You need a really specialist manager. The other way we've increased income is I do a lot of work in the NDI space. We got into the NDI space 7 years ago. And so, for example, that property that I mentioned earlier that, I picked up for 320, that's worth 1 million. We're actually selling that and converting that into a property. Currently it's getting 600 a week. Well, I'm converting effectively that money into something that's going to get $1,900 a week. And by doing that, people might think, hey, aren't you rorting the NDIs? Guess what? Doing this, it actually saves us taxpayers money because it costs more to have someone sitting in a hospital bed, taking our hospital beds, which we need so much of right now because backlogs, because of whatever's been happening over the last few years. I'd rather have them live in a house, personally. And if it's cheaper than a hospital bed, economically for us, it's much better to do it.
And you haven't created it anyway. You haven't created you're not the one that's taking the taxpayers' money. The government is, and they're just giving it out. So they're giving it out. Why not take it? That's
Well, one thing that we're doing is that we're actually working with so I own a tenancy management agency for people with disabilities, kind of like a property management agency, just like you, but specialized for people with specialist disability accommodation. We're more an NDIS provider than we are an accommodation provider, like in audit purposes, but we get invited by the NDIS, our team members, to actually consult with them about what direction it needs to head to in the future. And I think that's really important, that we get to shape the way things work from a real perspective, not from a crony capitalism perspective. Yeah.
Interesting. So I'm sure you're going to be talking more about that on the 21st. So we've got you speaking at our live Investor IQ event on the 21st of August, and I'll put the details and the links in the description of this video, so watch out for that. But just last question, Goro, before we go, is that, has it always been real estate, or have you looked at other investment vehicles? What's so good about real estate?
Well, I'll tell you what's great about real estate. And when Dad and I, and we do a couple other things, and we invest in the stock market. We've invested in options, stocks, electronic mini contracts, olive trees, right? Rent hands out. We've invested in a lot of things, and we calculated our net loss amongst everything outside of real estate, and it was over $1 million at one stage.
Wow.
Right. And we're like, holy shit, we lost $1 million. But then it also got, holy shit, we were able to lose $1 million. Why? Because property was paying for all of that. Right. And it's so that's why, yes, it's property, but the only kind of thing we kind of do outside of property is maybe we've got a few cars on Uber Car Share, which used to be called Car Next Door. And that's cool. So when we've got it, for example, we've got a holiday house in Gold Coast that gets used for Airbnb whenever we're not there. Same thing with a car. A car's there. It's an asset. I think it's a useless asset just sitting there. Why not make money out of it?
I like your
attitude. Not something sitting there. So it's use the share economy to make you money, not try to be a slave to it.
Yeah, I love that. So the message there is real estate, not olive trees.
Yes, real estate, not olive trees.
So Goro, thank you very much. Is there any final things that you'd like to say, or where can people actually find you if anyone wants to get in contact with you?
Well, the easiest way to get in touch with me, find me on Facebook. I'm really approachable. Or you can, check out my website, 10propertiesin10years.com. But also the easiest way to find me, if you're in Adelaide, is come to the event on the 21st. We'll be there with bells on, and we're live. We're going to be real, and we're going to have a lot of fun doing it.
And maybe some dinner after.
Yes.
Sounds fantastic. Goro, thank you very much for your time. And I actually look forward to seeing you live on the 21st of August.
Fantastic. And I'll do a real life property and beers with the guys there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.